All right, recording in progress. Awesome. Hey, everybody, welcome tonight to these lectures. So glad to have you here. I'm going to come off of the screen share for a second. So glad to have you here. What a beautiful, beautiful set of days we're in here in Seattle. Was it last week? No, it was 2 weeks ago. I did a lecture on a Monday. And it was last Monday was, of course, the brutally hot period of time. So glad you're all here and doing okay. I'm looking forward to these sets of lectures. I've learned a ton in putting these together, and also really kind of figured out and gotten a sense of some of my own kind of crystallized thoughts around the filibuster and around where we're at today, and also historically what it's taken to make progress against the filibuster. I told my colleague Charles Douglas, as part of Common Power, this morning. I told him this morning that I took a couple days off this weekend, and today I'm back and feeling like I'm ready to go to work in Mississippi. That's how energized and determined I am today. So glad you're here. Glad to have you here. And let's hop in. I'm gonna. Let me pop up the screen here. Let's see here. So the title, of course, of these lectures is How They Beat the Filibuster. Freedom Summer, Selma, LBJ, who's Lyndon Johnson, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And, you know, until COVID, my lectures that I would put together were usually 5 lectures in a row, and they were often a week apart. And I had done that really since the beginning, back in 2007, when I started doing public talks, which I had at that time contracted over the course of 10 weeks, 1 quarter at the UW, to do lectures every other week. And so it was 5 lectures. And I just always started thinking in terms of like a series of lectures. Since COVID has come along, I've truncated those mostly to 2 lectures on a time on a topic, but then I've done a couple 3 lectures. And this series is a 3 lecture series because there's a series of things, a collection of things that I want to get through and go through. The first lecture tonight is going to be about the United States Senate and really get into details on how the Senate works. Really quite a complicated institution. Second lecture tomorrow night is going to be the merger of the push for Freedom Summer in 1964 by the civil rights leadership and movement, and how that merged with the push for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then the third lecture is going to be about Selma and the way in which they catalyzed off of the work of the push in 1964 towards the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All roads in the civil rights movement lead in varying ways to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was the mountaintop goal of the movement, knowing the power of vote. And that's where our terminology in the organization that I work with, Common Power, comes from. This idea that the voting is the most common power, should be the most common power in a democracy. So all roads lead to Selma and to the 1965 Voting Rights Act when we look at kind of American racial and voting kind of history. So tonight about the Senate, tomorrow night about Mississippi, and the third night about Selma, all of these culminating in the Voting Rights Act with some takeaway lessons for where we are today. I'm going to do some question and answer tonight. Tomorrow night, I will not do any Q&A after the lecture because I got to hop out for a family thing right away. And then I'll do a bunch of Q&A Wednesday afterwards. So welcome here. I am feeling really energized by this work, feeling really excited about this content. Whenever I know content is coming together really well, I start to get fired up and start to get goofy and real happy about kind of just the process of teaching, about an education, kind of about the process of being an educator. So welcome tonight, everybody. How They Beat the Filibuster, Freedom Summer, Selma, LBJ, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Prologue. Those of you that have been around my lectures long enough know that I love to start with a prologue. It's a part of the story that is really interesting and just makes so much sense as you go along. But it kind of comes out of, but it does, it comes out of nowhere at first. And so it's a plot device, really. And I want to start with Lyndon Johnson in 1949. Lyndon Johnson gets elected to the United States Senate in 1948. And I have done a whole lecture at length about Lyndon Johnson. And there's no question that Lyndon Johnson steals his election in 1948. I mean, like, this is no fictitious, fake steal. Like, this is legit steal. Johnson steals his election and wins in 1948 as a senator from Texas. And he comes to the Senate in 1949, having won by like 217 votes, something like this. But again, these are all, he should have lost by thousands. Okay. But he comes with barely having won. And he gives his inaugural speech on March 9th. And in the US Senate, the first speech you give as a senator is a big deal. It's a tradition, and people come around and listen to your speech, even if they're not that interested in the topic, but they want to be there just for your moment. I had the incredible honor to be at the US Senate in 2018, early 2018, and to go into the gallery. And on the particular day that I was there, Doug Jones from Alabama was giving his inaugural speech. And we listened to him talk about gun safety and the importance of that. And that was so unusual to hear from an Alabama senator. It was incredible. And a lot of people came out to hear that speech, a lot of senators. So they were all sitting right down there. Lyndon Johnson gives his inaugural speech on March 9th, 1949. And this is the title of the talk: Unlimited Debate, the Last Defense of Reason. Unlimited debate is the senatorial terminology for what we have over time come to call the filibuster. Unlimited debate is the language of the Senate when they talk about the ability to talk and to talk and to talk and debate, that they should have unlimited debate. And Johnson chooses this topic in defense of unlimited debate, making the case for the importance of unlimited debate. He chooses this as his first speech in the Senate. And this speech doesn't just drop into the middle of the Senate. It comes in the midst of a debate, in the midst of what we would call today a filibuster against an anti-lynching bill. The bill would get rid of lynching, would have made it a federal crime to lynch someone. And Johnson stands up in his inaugural speech and makes the case that the Southern Democrats should have unlimited debate, and thus they should never be forced to have to vote on this bill. All right. And I just want to pull an excerpt from this speech. All right. He says, when we of the South rise here to speak against this resolution or to speak against the civil rights proposals, we are not speaking against the Negro race, Johnson says. That phraseology of when we of the South, eventually this comes to be colloquially known as Johnson's "We of the South" speech. It's LBJ's "We of the South" speech. We are not attempting to keep alive the old flames of hate and bigotry, Johnson said. We are instead trying to prevent those flames from being rekindled. And this is the classic argument that it is Southerners who are actually the not racists in this. And the only reason they're trying to talk so much is they're trying to impress upon those racist Northerners that they really understand race relations. We are trying to tell the rest of the nation that this is not the way to accomplish what so many want to do for the Negro. Of course, this terminology of Negro, not our terminology today. It was of the time, though. We are trying to tell the Senate that there is referring to this issue of, like, the Southerners have the high moral ground. We are trying to tell the Senate that with all the sincerity we can command, but it seems that ears and minds were long ago closed. This is, in a nutshell, the argument that Southerners were the true non-racists fighting for Black Americans, and that the unlimited debate that they were participating in and that they were defending was really to enlighten everybody. And it was Northerners or Westerners who had closed their ears and minds long ago. Johnson makes this case in his opening address. And I want to show you the last couple paragraphs of his address, drawing from a photograph of the congressional record, which is where all speeches are cataloged in. And the first few words on this image I'm going to show you is him referring to Northern senators wanting that they should be very careful because it might be them that are going to lose their free speech at some point. So he's talking about those of Northern states should cherish their freedom, our freedom of expression. They should cherish the Southerners' freedom of expression as they cherish theirs, the Northerners. But for the grace of God in the United States Senate, we might today be debating the limitation of their freedom to speak or that of the press rather than our own. And then here he goes. If Mr. President, he's not referring to the actual president, you call the person who's presiding over the Senate the president. If Mr. President, I were given a choice, if I should have the opportunity to send into the countries behind the Iron Curtain one freedom, and only one, I know what my choice would be. I would send to those lands the very freedom we are attempting to disown here in the Senate. I would send to those nations the right of unlimited debate in their legislative chambers. It would go as merely a seed, but the harvest would be bountiful. For by planting in their system this bit of freedom, we would see all freedoms grow as they have never grown before on the soils of Eastern Europe. This freedom we debate, Mr. President, is fundamental and indispensable. He's talking about freedom of unlimited debate to talk forever in the Senate. It stands as the fountainhead of all of our freedoms. If we now, in haste and irritation, shut off this freedom, we shall be cutting off the most vital safeguard which minorities possess against the tyranny of momentary majorities. I do not want my name listed as one of those who took this freedom away from the world when the world most needed it. And with that, Johnson was done. And with that, the rest of the Southern Democratic Caucus. And in the former Confederate states, there were 22 senators, 11 states, 22 senators, all Democrats. They all stood up and unanimously applauded Johnson's speech. And this person right here, a guy by the name of Richard Russell, also known as Dick Russell, was the head of the Southern Democratic Caucus. He was a senator from Georgia. And in the South, because the Democrats controlled the South, they were able to elect and then re-elect and keep re-electing their senators. And as a result, their senators would gain tremendous power in a Senate chamber where power goes to those with seniority. And Russell had been around a long time. Russell was an outright segregationist and racist, and he was the leader of the Southern Democratic Caucus, and he was Lyndon Johnson's mentor. There's so much going on here that I could spend this entire lecture on about why Russell and Johnson have such a close tie. But Russell hugs Johnson in this moment, steps outside of the chamber to talk to the press, because no press are allowed on the floor of the chamber. He steps outside the chamber and he says, "That's the finest speech I've ever seen or heard from a Southern man." Russell gives his stamp of approval to this brand new, just to the Senate, Texas Democratic Senator Lyndon Johnson, who starts his speech with "We of the South." I'm going to end this lecture with Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson breaking the filibuster, okay? In 1949, it's Lyndon Johnson defending with everything he's got the filibuster. This is the kind of trajectory that Johnson goes through, and maybe other senators can go through. All right, let's talk about the Senate. And I want to just say that I have officially become a total political nerd. Now, I know you all think like I've been a political nerd because of the level of enthusiasm and energy and detail that I have in paying attention to politics. But I am now down in the weeds on procedures and protocols of how bills get passed, parliamentary motions, and I was a department chair at the University of Washington for 11 years, and we follow Robert's Rules of Order. And I was always like barely had enough knowledge to run those meetings. And there were always a couple other colleagues who knew a bit more than me, and that I would say to them, like, can we pass this motion? Do we have to rescind the motion? Is there an amendment? Is it a friendly amendment? What's going on here? Can we call the question? But now I'm starting to really see how this all plays out, and it's both fascinating and terrifying. And it's also part of what the Democrats need to be absolutely the best at if they're going to pass any bills in the next few months because of the closeness of this Senate. So let's talk about the Senate, okay? And let's start with the filibuster, okay? It's a weird word. It's an unusual word. And according to the US Senate page, the US Senate has all these kind of glossary. They have a full glossary of their terms. The filibuster is an informal term for an attempt to block or delay Senate action on a bill or other matter by debating it at length, by offering numerous procedural motions, or by any other delay or obstructive actions. So it's an attempt to block or delay Senate action on a bill or some other matter by debating it unlimited, by offering procedural motions over and over and over again, or at constantly, or by any other delay or obstructive actions. That's what the filibuster is. It's not just the way that we commonly think about it as a kind of like endless debate. The word filibuster, it comes from a French word. I'm sorry, excuse me, a Dutch word. It comes from a Dutch word that means pirate. And I think it is like a verb and the idea is that senators were going to pirate the debate, or we might more commonly say today, like hijack the debate and take it off into a place and then not allow it to come back to where people wanted it to come back to. That's what it meant to filibuster when the term started to come, to pirate away, to take away a debate and to seize it and take it away. All right. I'm going to talk at length about how it plays out, but I'm not really interested here in all of the ways you can live out a filibuster. I'm really only interested in it in terms of this kind of notion of endless debate on the Senate floor. And we have what I'm going to call 4 conventional wisdom perspectives today about the filibuster. Okay, 4 kind of like commonly held perspectives. The first is that the filibuster is established by the Constitution. It's not, but it's a commonly held position that the filibuster is an idea that is actually written into the Constitution. It's not, it's a Senate rule. And any Senate rule can be changed. Okay. Second conventional wisdom is that the filibuster supposedly spurs bipartisan actions by forcing majorities to get and at this time 60 votes to pass a bill. The idea is that the filibuster must force the majority to have to talk to the minority about legislation. Kyrsten Sinema, a current US Senator from Arizona, wrote an opinion piece in the Washington Post about 2 weeks ago where she made this exact argument that filibusters are part of spurring bipartisan action. Maybe that was so at some point, no idea. It is clearly not the case today, not remotely today. In fact, we can make a very compelling case that it destroys bipartisan action because the minority, having the numbers that they need to engage in a filibuster, have no motivation whatsoever to participate in a debate, in a conversation. Conventional wisdom item number 3 is that the filibuster is not a racial tool, that it hasn't been used distinctly for racial purposes, that it's just a neutral rule that's been used in the Senate. I'll show you some evidence today, and we're going to see plenty of discussion in the next 2 days that this just isn't even close to true. okay? And conventional wisdom number 4 is that the filibuster today cannot be beaten, that it just can't be beaten because of the diabolicalness of Mitch McConnell in the minority, or because the polarization of our time makes it so powerful, or because of the motivations of the political party in itself that's in the minority, their unwillingness to even desire to find common ground with the majority party because of the strategic advantages of blocking the majority party's legislation. The first 3 for sure are not true. The fourth one, the jury is out. Can the filibuster be beaten today? I don't know. All I know is it has been. We're going to look at it when it was. And there are some things consistent about that period that we can draw from today, some that do not apply today. But I do know that we have an ethical responsibility to that man right back there, John Lewis, and so many others, to try. So we may not be able to succeed, but we got to try. Okay. So in this lecture series, I want to suggest to you why the first 3 for sure are not true, and the fourth, why it is that we might have a chance. Okay. Why it is that we might have a chance. So the filibuster, as I'm going to focus on it, is the blocking or delaying of Senate action on a bill by debating it at length. That's what I want to focus on. Just a second. My wife poked her head in and I didn't know if there was something going on. This is the Zoom world. All right, the Zoom world. Okay. The Senate. In order to understand the way the filibuster functions and why it's so potent politically, we got to spend a little bit of time thinking about how the chamber works today, how the U.S. Senate works today. And I'm going to bet that nobody who's watching this has like a really detailed grasp of the ways in which the U.S. Senate works, because no normal human being would. We think there's a vote and this is how it happens. And for someone my age, it's because I was completely bamboozled by the Schoolhouse Rock video. I'm just a bill, which we're going to see here in a few minutes. Okay. But that's not it. Nobody have no idea. It doesn't give us any clear sense of how the Senate works. I want to, in a kind of as quick and concise a way as possible, give an overview of how the Senate works today. And I want to start by saying that bills in the Senate have 4 life or death moments before there is a final vote. There are 4 moments along the way where a bill can either gain life and move along or die and be done before you even get to a vote on the bill. So regardless of the vote, whatever the vote's going to be, there are 4 moments along the way, at minimum 4, because there could be a whole lot more, but at minimum 4 moments where a bill can gain life or can be shut down and wiped out. Okay. So let's use a little timeline here, a visual timeline. There's a bill idea. Let's say we want to pass a piece of legislation that would make it they give every U.S. citizen the right to vote. We don't actually have that in place in this country. We do not have a national right to vote for citizens. We do not. What we have is a whole series of laws that say you cannot deny the right to vote for X, Y, and Z, and a whole bunch of other things. Those are all negatively worded. They say you can't take it away for X reasons. I would love to have a positive statement that all U.S. citizens have the right to vote of a certain age. Fine, make it 18 years old like today. All citizens of 18 years old or older have the right to vote. That would be a positively worded idea. So let's say I get elected to Senate. John Ossoff is currently the youngest U.S. senator at the age of 33. I'm pretty sure at the age of 54 that I'd be right in there with my peeps. All right. So let's say I get elected and I have an idea for a bill. Okay. All right. The first life or death moment occurs real quickly after I file my bill idea. And you have to literally file it into a database, the bill idea. And what happens at that first moment, imagine like you're running the bases at a baseball game, and this is the first base. All right. The majority leader, the person whose party has the majority in the Senate and has been elected by their fellow party members, the majority leader gets the chance to decide, will they put the bill that I've come up with on the calendar? Will they schedule it for consideration? And the majority leader has almost sole say over this. And the only way they don't have sole say over this is very complicated. So I'm just going to more or less say that they have sole discretion over this. All right. So the majority leader has what's called a scheduling veto. They cannot schedule a bill if they don't want to. And it happens all the time, especially if you're evil. And Mitch McConnell has been. Mitch McConnell self-adopted the name the Grim Reaper as a majority leader, saying that bills came to him during Obama's last couple of years. And then even when he was minority leader before that he wanted to kill bills in the Senate. That's what he did. When he became majority leader, he just wouldn't put bills on the schedule that Democrats were interested in. He would practice his scheduling veto. So here's a Politico headline from 2 years ago, 2019, when McConnell says he won't allow a vote on what has become HR 1 or S1. And McConnell said this, when asked at a news conference why he wasn't bringing the House electoral reform bill to the Senate floor, McConnell said with a grin, because I get to decide what we vote on. So the majority leader has dictatorial control. And these are one of the many contradictions built into our democratic system, that the US Senate majority leader functions like a dictator in this democratic space. So the first place a bill can either gain life or be put to death is when the majority leader decides whether to calendar it or not, to schedule it or not. Okay. Well, here's a little fact. We didn't really have Senate minority or majority leaders until the 1920s. Before that, nobody functioned in the way that we understand them to run today. They weren't there. So when you look at the list of Senate majority and minority leaders, the US Senate's official list goes back to the 1920s. And the very first majority leader who gets officially named and functions in the way that I'm talking about it, of having this kind of power, is in 1925. So when you look all the way from 1925 to 2021, we've had a whole bunch of majority leaders. We've had 22 of them. And guess what? 16 of them have been Southern. 16, because they keep sending their senators back to the Congress. That's what they've done historically, and they've gained power. So one little reality that is hugely important for the American democracy is that the majority leader has the ability to kill bills, and they've been overwhelmingly Southern over the last 100 years. All right. Point number 2, when a bill can either gain life or die, is that the majority leader, if he or she, and I believe it's only been a he, yes, it has only been he's, the majority leader then decides if he's going to allow the bill to move forward, to get calendared, to get scheduled, is which committee is the bill going to go into? The protocols in the Senate, in almost all cases, but not all, but in almost all cases, is that a bill that is going to get scheduled will go first to a committee. It will get referred to a committee. And there are all these committee structures. I think there's 20-ish committees in the US Senate. There are all these committees in the US Senate, and a bill gets referred to a committee. Which committee a bill gets referred to is monumentally important, because there are people who head up the committees and they have their own political viewpoints. They also have working styles. And so it really, really matters which committee a bill gets referred to. So as an example, I've said there were 16 Southern majority leaders. All right. Well, an awful lot of committee leaders have also been Southern. All right. And historically, a majority leader from the South could allow a bill to get scheduled, but then kill it by a civil rights bill, for example, or a voting rights bill, but kill it by sending it to a committee where the committee leader was going to do nothing about it. All right. And so this is one of the most famous committee leaders from the South, Senator Jim Eastland from the Mississippi Delta. And James O. Eastland was one of the most notorious Southern bigots to serve in the US Senate. And that looks like he's holding the Confederate flag, but he's actually holding the Mississippi flag, because the Mississippi flag had the Confederate flag as part of it up in the left corner until, I don't know, was it about a year and a half ago, something like that, from the 1950s until a year and a half ago or so. And so he's there, and I don't know who he's talking to, but this is Jim Eastland. And when Eastland died, the New York Times obituary included this language. At the peak of Eastland's authority in the mid-1960s, Senator Eastland claimed that he had been responsible for the defeat of 127 civil rights bills that came before the Judiciary Committee, usually by refusing to allow the committee to act on them. So the majority leader could either outright just end the bill, or if the majority leader allowed the bill to get scheduled, the majority leader could then make another monumentally life or death choice about which committee the bill was going to go to. So enormous, enormous power for a committee leader. I'm sorry, for the majority leader. Well, today Chuck Schumer is the majority leader by barely, by like, inches. He's the majority leader. And as an example of how this can matter, consider this, and you probably can't read this, but this is from a press release just a week ago, in which it announces about the Rules Committee that U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar, chairwoman of the Committee on Rules and Administration with oversight over federal elections and campaign finance law, today announced the Rules Committee will hold a field hearing in Georgia on Monday, July 19th. So it's coming up in a couple weeks. This will be the first field hearing held by the Rules Committee in 20 years. 20 years. At the hearing, witnesses will testify about recently enacted legislation to restrict voting in the state and the need for basic federal standards to protect the freedom to vote. Subsequent hearings on critical voting, campaign finance, and ethics reforms will be announced at a later date. So we're getting the first field hearing on the right to vote in this country by the Rules Committee in 20 years. You know who's in that Rules Committee? All the biggies. You got Klobuchar, you got Schumer, you got Durbin over here on the Democratic side. Over on the Republican side, you got McConnell, Cruz. I think Paul is in there. I mean, it's just it's an unbelievable committee structure, and they're holding the first field hearing on voting rights in 20 years. The committees can really, really matter. Okay. So I'm going to segment these two steps, first base and second base, from the next couple that come along. The first two I've showed so far are determined by the majority leader. This is a partisan-driven power. Which party controls the majority gets this power. Mitch McConnell refused to take up any electoral reform legislation in his time as majority leader, getting the two senators elected out of Georgia gave the majority to the Democrats and allows us to even try to break a filibuster on the freedom to vote. Those first two steps then are under the power of the majority leader. The third life or death moment for legislation is when the majority leader brings the bill out of the committee and says, we want to begin the debate on this. And there is what's called a motion to proceed. There's a vote on a motion to proceed. To proceed to what? To proceed to debate. Debate has not begun yet in the Senate. There's been discussion in the committee, but we have not begun debate in the full Senate. And so the majority leader puts forward a motion, or yes, it's a he is on the floor, and he puts forward a motion to proceed to debate. Okay, in order for that motion to pass and for debate to begin, you actually need 60 votes in the U.S. Senate, not 50 plus one, but 60 votes, because it can be what's called filibustered. It can be filibustered. Anything that can be debated in the Senate can be filibustered. So 60 votes are required in order to begin debate. Now, the motion to proceed can be waived if there's what's called unanimous consent, which is that nobody says they want to debate it. But that never happens on contentious items, okay? So you need 60 votes to even begin debate. This is where the other day, 2 weeks ago, the S1 bill didn't even begin debate because they only got 50 votes here on the motion to proceed. So you need 60 votes to proceed to debate. Then if debate happens, if you actually have debate, you got to end it at some point. And then at that point, you have a vote that's called a vote to cloture, a cloture vote, which is to close the debate. And you got to have 60 votes again. You got to now break the filibuster a second time in order to actually get to a final vote. So you have 2 votes here that are 60 vote threshold votes. You got to have 60% of the US Senate vote to begin debate and 60% of the US Senate to vote to end debate. That's necessary. If you cannot cross those thresholds, you will not get to actually vote on whether a bill should become a law. We won't. Okay? So I'm going to call this like the filibuster zone. All right? Minority power exists in this space. The first quadrant over on the left is what we'll call partisan power, the partisan power to hold the majority. The next zone, the second zone, is what we'll call the minority power, the filibuster, where the filibuster can be enacted. If you can run the gauntlet and get 60 votes to begin and then to end debate on legislation, then you've gone through the 4 life or death moments before a final vote. All right. And then, and only then, can you have a final vote. And then on the final vote, you actually only need a majority. You only need a majority on that final vote, 50 plus 1. Okay, 50 plus 1. So what the Democrats showed 2 weeks ago on S1 is that they can get 50 votes. And then with the vice president's vote, they can get to 51. So the Senate, the Democrats, because of Manchin's compromises and the Democrats' willingness to compromise on S1, they show that they can pass this bill if they can get through the filibuster zone. Okay, they can get through the first zone because they have the majority power. But they got to be able to get through the filibuster zone, what we're going to call the minority power zone. All right, this is the way the Senate works. This right here is how the US Senate works. Right here. You want to pass a bill? You got to get to 60 votes in order to even get to a final vote. All right. Now, this is not the way in which we learn about our political system, and it's not the way the news coverage very effectively tells us about the political system. Much more common is for us to get a Schoolhouse Rock version of how our legislation works in Congress. So let's just take a second here and see what the Schoolhouse Rock version is, because some of you may not know what Schoolhouse Rock is, but it was an afternoon and Saturday morning little cartoons that were these vignettes about how American civic life is supposed to work. And when you watch them today, they're deeply racist and sexist, okay? And they're also deeply simplistic. So this one is racist only more or less in the representation and sexist in its representation, and also incredibly simplistic. So let's see how this works. According to Schoolhouse Rock.
Bill. Whew, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. How I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
See, it's just that easy. It's just that easy. A whole bunch of men somehow come along. They debate and they argue. They debate and they argue. And somehow, at the end of the day, they become a law. It's just super simple. All right. No, actually, it's this. Majority leader gets to decide the bill lives or dies. Then there's a debate. You need 60 votes to win, to get through those debates twice. And then you can have a final vote. All right. That middle zone is the minority power zone of, and by here I mean numerically minority power zone in the United States Senate. And I want to focus for the rest of this lecture and then for the next couple about that zone right there. Okay. But let's just be very clear that the first zone, that if you do not have the partisan majority in the Senate the way it works today, you do not have any power in the US Senate, hardly. So our election engagement matters every single election. Okay. 60 votes. How did we get to this idea of 60 votes? All right. Where did this come from? How did we get here to 60 votes? Why is that the case? Because here's the spoiler. It's not required to be 60 votes. It's a arbitrary thing. All right. And I recommend this book by Adam Gentleson called Kill Switch: The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy. Gentleson was the chief of staff to Senator Harry Reid, a Democratic majority leader for, I think, 6 years, and has written a book that came out about a year ago. Tremendously easy read, very interesting, and enlightening in all kinds of ways about the United States Senate and the filibuster. And the metaphor of the kill switch is that a kill switch electrically is a switch that when you flip it off, you turn off power completely to a very large entity. Like you commonly will think about a kill switch to a restaurant or to a gas station, where you flip one switch because you want to control everything and save everybody, kind of limit the danger if something's really out of control. You want to turn all the electricity off in one shot. And so the kill switch is the switch that takes everything out. And he's saying that the filibuster works that way in the Senate. It destroys the power all the way around, but not just for the Senate. He says for American democracy. And I agree. The Senate is the primary problem in our national politics, that if I could solve one thing, it would be the US Senate. So here's a quick overview of how we got to 60 votes as the threshold required to get through the filibuster zone. We got to start with the Articles of Confederation, which was the document that united the colonies when they were fighting in the Revolutionary War, and it united them and brought them together. All 13 of them signed on to the Articles of Confederation. All of them were skeptical of each other, had significant disagreements in all kinds of ways, including enslavement of human beings. And so they wanted a loose agreement together to work together. And they set a standard that there could be no national laws or changes to their agreement that they had written without what was called a super majority, without 3/4 of all of the states, or at that time colonies, agreeing. So the Articles of Confederation was this uniting together of the colonies with the agreement that there could be no changes in federal or national laws without a super majority agreeing to it. They wanted the bar to be very high so that there'd be significant consensus. So in the Articles of Confederation, they had this idea of the supermajority, but it ended up not working well. It made it almost impossible to do anything. All right. So people coming out of the Articles of Confederation, when they went to write the U.S. Constitution, which was first brought to the country in 1789, the reality is that they didn't want that supermajority anymore. And Hamilton and Madison, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, who were the primary writers of the U.S. Constitution, both believed strongly that the U.S. Congress should function on a majority rule principle. Both the House and the Senate should have majority decision making. They did not want a supermajority. They wanted a singular majority where you would have to get one more vote over half. Okay? One more vote over half to have a majority. And this is an excerpt from Gentelson's book. The reason the framers set the threshold at a majority is that they wrote the Constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation, which they saw as a disaster because it required a supermajority of Congress to pass most major legislation. As Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 22, the idea that a supermajority encouraged cooperation had proven deceptive. What at first sight may seem a remedy is, in reality, a poison, Hamilton had written. Rather than encourage cooperation, he prophesied, the effect of requiring more than a majority would be actually to embarrass the administration, to destroy the energy of the government, and to substitute the pleasure, caprice, or artifices of a minority to the regular deliberations and decision of a respectable majority. And this is classic kind of, not 1700s language, but the point here is that there was no desire to have anything more than a respectable majority, to actually have a one vote majority to make decisions in both the House and the Senate. All right. This was the idea behind both of those legislative branches of government, just like it's the idea behind the US Supreme Court. You don't need a supermajority on the court. Okay. You just need a singular vote majority. Well, when the Senate was started, they had an easy mechanism to make sure that a majority vote was what decided all legislation. There was no idea of 60 votes or any other number. It was just a majority. And the way it worked is that they had this rule called the previous question rule, which is that at any point in time, someone could say that they wanted to vote on the previous question, which was the topic of the day, whatever the topic of the conversation was. And you could vote on whether or not you would have a vote. And all you had to do was have a majority that would say they want to have a vote. So by majority, you could end debate. You could end the debate with a majority. It was called the previous question rule, and it was written in to the Senate rules from the beginning. It was called the previous question rule, which said, I want to have a vote on the thing that we're talking about, on what's called in Senate language, the previous question. And you would have a majority vote on whether or not to have that vote on the previous question. All right. In 1805, 1 year after he killed Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, functioning as the outgoing vice president at the time, said, we don't really need the previous question because nobody ever makes it hard to want to have to end the debate. Like ending the debate is no big deal, MBD. So Burr said, you can get rid of that rule. We don't need the previous question rule. And in 1806, the next year, the Senate took up Burr's recommendation from 1805 and removed the previous question rule. What this meant concretely is that there was no mechanism to end debate. Burr had said, we don't need this anymore. And the senators had agreed with him because they all felt like there would never be any problem ending debate. There would never be any problem. So we don't need this anymore. So after 1806, there was no rule about how you ended debate. If somebody or somebodies wanted to debate forever, they could. But the protocols, the norms were that people didn't do this. Like they would all agree at some point to end debate. Okay. And sure enough, in the 1820s and 1830s, the Southerners, who are starting to get quite angry about what they see as this attack on Southern slave power, begin to engage in this thing that gets a name called filibustering, to pirate away the debate, to take it over. All right. And it particularly comes into play with John Calhoun, the kind of lead Southerner, the Richard Russell, the Dick Russell of his time, the leader of the Southern Democratic Caucus. And Calhoun begins to talk and talk and talk whenever he is opposing legislation that could impact the South in ways they don't want it to. And he begins to get fellow Southern Democrats to join him, okay? But mostly, they would just, if he wanted to get around Calhoun, you just wait long enough, and eventually Calhoun would feel the peer pressure of the U.S. Senate and would stop the debate. All right, so here's another passage from the book. In these early iterations of the filibuster under Calhoun, Gentleson writes, the majority could usually wait out the minority. The norm that the majority should eventually carry the day remained. Despite all Calhoun's effort, the minority had still not found a way to reliably stop bills that the majority wanted to pass. There's no rule about how to stop debate, but the social pressures of how the Senate worked led the Senate to, by and large, stop debate if there was enough people who wanted to stop debate. It was purely peer pressure within the Senate, okay? And then in World War I, Woodrow Wilson wants to pass a bill that's going to give him some power to extend dollars and use them in certain ways as part of the war effort. And the bill does not pass in the Senate because of a filibuster that is put forward by a coalition of Western and Southern, which is a very common coalition of Western and Southern senators, and it doesn't pass. And Wilson just loses it gets very, very mad and goes on this public campaign shaming them and saying, we need some kind of rule for how you can end debate in the Senate. The American public deserves it. And in 1917, the US Senate agrees and passes a new rule, a brand new rule known as Rule 22, which said that 67% of senators, if they vote yes to end a debate, could end the filibuster debate. They could end it. You needed 67% of senators. Now, it was a little bit more than 67 folks. I'm sorry, it was a little bit less than 67 folks because we didn't have 100 senators at the time. All right, so it was right about 65 at the time to end a filibuster. That's the rule in 1917, Rule 22. That's the rule in the Senate, Rule 22, okay? The idea was that if you gave the majority, the supermajority, a rule that they could be empowered to end debate when they wanted to end debate. The whole idea was that really people of decent good faith would, because this is what the Senate set up to do, to have votes, would find ways to end votes. And so the entire logic behind the rule was that give the supermajority a rule and they will get there. They will find a way to end the debate. So creating the rule was to enhance the power of the supermajority. It was not to help the minority to block the bills. It was to give the supermajority a way to stop debate. And the assumption is that this would be able to be done. This would be able to be done in most reasonable ways. This would always be able to be done, okay? In 1970, after the filibusters of the 1950s and 1960s, and I'll be talking about a couple of them tomorrow and Friday, the US Senate adopted another kind of, this isn't a rule, it is a rule, it's not as famous as Rule 22, in which they created two tracks to avoid the way in which a filibuster would just stop all debate in the Senate. Starting in 1970, if the minority wanted to filibuster a bill, then they could register their filibuster, debate, and negotiations would then ensue on that bill. But meanwhile, another track of legislation would be brought to the floor and could move forward, okay? What this did is allowed the filibuster to not stop all Senate business, which sounds positive. But what it did is it removed the topic of debate out of the public eye. It removed it from all of the attention that it would get when there was a filibuster. And that removal of all that attention and the actual stopping of the Senate's power allowed the Senate to kind of chug along just fine and allowed the minority to register filibusters whenever they wanted without any concern with kind of really public backlash against them. This two tracks model continues to be in place today. This is why we do not see, when it comes to filibusters, people holding the floor and speaking on behalf of why they're filibustering, because the Senate moves along on its other legislation and allows the filibuster to basically be an invisible entity. All right, I'm going to talk about that in a couple days. In 1975, Rule 22 was amended to be 60% of senators instead of 67%. This was a quote unquote reform to allow the filibuster to be overcome easier by getting to just 60% of votes. This is where we get to the 60 vote threshold out of a 100 vote Senate today. So two defining characteristics of the filibuster today is you got to get to 60 votes to overcome it, 60%. And right now it's invisible. The filibuster is a singular vote that if you don't get to 60, the actual filibuster that blocks the 60 vote threshold is a behind the scenes endeavor. The public vote is, the vote is public, but then the negotiations and the discussion to try to break the filibuster goes away from the public limelight, okay? And in 2007, Mitch McConnell became minority leader. This was an incredibly important election for the minority leadership when McConnell became minority leader, and eventually he would in 2015 become majority leader. And McConnell understood the power of the filibuster and how it could be wielded not merely as a regional endeavor as it had in the 1960s, but as a partisan endeavor. And what McConnell does is he uses the filibuster to empower the party that's in the minority. And under Mitch McConnell, the filibuster becomes an incredibly powerful partisan tool. All right, incredibly powerful partisan tool. Mitch McConnell, as an evil genius, elevates the usage of the filibuster as a minority blocking party, a partisan tool. The focus has moved away from the filibuster being something that has moved away from the idea of the Rule 22, now which is amended, is moved away from the idea that a supermajority has the power to kind of break it. It's now become seen as a way in which the minority can use Rule 22 to its advantage. All right. So here's a graph over time that gives us a sense of the way in which the filibuster has become so omnipresent. A cloture motion is when motions are filed to end debate on either the motion to proceed or the actual floor debate. So by looking at cloture motions, we can look at how many times a filibuster has been enacted and thus needs to be broken. All right. How many times do we have to break the filibuster? And so we can look at the kind of the presence of the filibuster's usage over time by looking at how commonly cloture motions have been filed. And we can see this is by Lee Drutman, who studies American politics. He writes a blog. He does stuff for MSNBC and NBC News. And we can see the presence of the filibuster increasing dramatically over time. The first major shift is in the 1970s, when the two-track filibuster system begins and the minority no longer needs to hold the Senate floor. Beginning with that, we begin to get more filibusters because there's no kind of like public pain involved in filibustering. There's no public pain involved. We begin to get an increase of that in the 1970s. And then we get our next major shift in 2007, when Mitch McConnell becomes a Senate minority leader, and McConnell takes the numbers up through the roof. And we can see that those numbers have stayed very high. I mean, they're at their all-time high by Chuck Schumer in 2019 because they attempted to filibuster. It was the only power that the Democrats had because McConnell wouldn't bring any legislation to the floor. So the Democrats have become essentially corrupted by this mechanism that McConnell has perfected. All right. So the filibuster as a weaponized tool is not good for our democracy, not a bit. It's become a partisan blocking tool. 60 votes required in that filibuster minority power zone. If you can get 60 votes on the motion to proceed and 60 votes on the motion to end debate on the cloture vote, then and only then can you pass a bill with 51 votes. Okay. All right. The last part of this lecture tonight, I want to start to focus us towards 1964 and 1965. Race in the filibuster is a story that's part of the American political story. The filibuster has been used especially to block civil rights and voting rights advances in this country. It is not a tool that has just been randomly distributed. It's a tool that has been used especially to block racial progress. Okay. Here's Mitch McConnell, March 23rd. What is that? 3 months ago, saying the filibuster has no racial history at all. There's no dispute among historians, McConnell said. I want to read this again. McConnell says the filibuster has no racial history at all. None. There's no dispute among historians. Actually, that is as false as the big lie of Donald Trump around elections. All right. It is exactly the kind of lie that McConnell has specialized in. A completely amoral, cold-blooded fiction. All right. To give you a sense of what a fiction it is, this is just one dipping our toe into this. Kevin Kruse is an awesome historian. I think he's at Dartmouth University or Princeton, can't remember, one of those places. And he's got like 200,000 followers on Twitter. And he writes great stuff and gives these little lessons on Twitter. And after McConnell said this on that day of March 23rd, he just put forward a thread where he just off the top of his head listed filibuster moments that were anti-civil rights legislation. And he just, from the top of his head, kind of started listing these 1874, 1875, and on and on. And he kept going, 1921, 22, 25, 26, and 35, 38, 45, 48. And he's got 3 more tweets that brings it up to today. I'm not going to show you all of them. Kruse at the end of the tweet says, these are not even an exhaustive list. This is just off the top of my head. All right. So McConnell's statement that the filibuster has no racial history to it is absolutely 100% a lie. Here's Michael Lee works for the Brennan Center. He's one of folks I just have the greatest respect for. He writes a lot about voting today. Here's him tweeting yesterday about Franklin Roosevelt expressing very contemporary sounding frustrations with the filibuster in the 1930s. So here's FDR's words. And I know you probably can't read this, but I'll read it. This is FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. Now you spoke about that anti-lynching bill. So he's talking to the press. Now you spoke about that anti-lynching bill. You've got a situation up there on the Hill, Capitol Hill, which goes back well over 100 years when the Senate began calling itself the greatest debating society in the world, the most exclusive club in the world. Quote, quote, we operate without any rules whatsoever, unquote. One of the inherent rights of a senator is to filibuster just as long as he can stand on his feet, Roosevelt says. We operate without rules. Again, he quotes them. Now, one of the things that is a perfectly practical thing for everybody here, and that is to put to every candidate for the United States Senate the question: are you in favor of the Senate continuing its right to filibuster and prevent bringing to a vote certain legislation that a minority of the senators, a rather small minority, is opposing? The majority in favor of it, would you bring it to their power to vote on it? If you can get a vote on the anti-lynching bill in the Senate, it would go through. We all know it. Absolutely. Southern Democrats, including Lyndon Johnson, opposed anti-lynching bills and used the filibuster to squash them over and over and over again. Gentleson in Kill Switch has this data point. From the end of Reconstruction in 1877 until 1964, the only bills that were ever fully stopped by filibusters were civil rights bills. All of the others that were filibustered eventually came to a vote. That didn't mean they passed, but eventually came to a vote. The only bills that were ever fully stopped by filibusters were civil rights bills. Of course, it's racial. The American political system is deeply racist and racialized. So of course, the filibuster, this incredible power, it's like almost perfectly designed for a shrinking white majority becoming increasingly a minority in this country to hold power. It's almost like designed for exactly this. Okay. And William S. White, I'm going to pop that up again in a second. William S. White was a famous journalist and a publisher in the 1940s and 50s in this country, owned and published the Kansas City Star, very powerful editor in the Midwest. He put it in these terms. He said, the Senate is the South's unending revenge upon the North for Gettysburg. I mean, that is perfectly placed. Like, it's the South's unending revenge upon the North for defeating the South at Gettysburg and in the Civil War. In 1963, as the civil rights movement increasingly publicly pushed for civil rights and voting rights, it had moved from lunch counters and freedom rides to integrating businesses and organizations to now large-scale public protests and demonstrations. And we are all familiar with the March on Washington on August 28th, 1963. And indeed, on Wednesday, I'm going to be joined at the beginning of the lecture on Wednesday by Common Power colleague, AJ Musewe. And she's going to talk about an awesome series that she and I are going to do in August, timed around the March on Washington, about a speech given by John Lewis at that March on Washington. This is the program for the March on Washington. And, you know, I know it's small print. You can find this online, but it's got all these speakers on it. A. Philip Randolph, John Lewis, Jim Farmer, and on down, Whitney Young, Mahalia Jackson saying, and then eventually to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Okay. That's the front page of the program. That's the front page of the program. The back page of the program had some further details, including a list of demands. And number one on that demand sheet was comprehensive and effective civil rights legislation, of course, from the present Congress, without compromise or filibuster, to guarantee all Americans access to all public accommodations, decent housing, adequate and integrated education, and the right to vote. Number one demand, without compromise or filibuster, the right to vote. Because they were very intimately familiar with the way in which Southern Democratic senators had employed the filibuster to block civil rights legislation. And in 1957 and in 1960, Lyndon Johnson, as Senate Majority Leader, had been able to pass civil rights legislation, but had done so avoiding Southern filibusters. There had been a person or two who had filibustered, but they had never had a caucus together to filibuster. And that's because Johnson had really stripped the power mostly from the bills in 1957, 1960, but there were modest increases in the advance for civil rights. But when we began to push, when the fight began to move in 1963, 1964, and 1965 for national, congressional, significant revolutionary legislation around civil and voting rights, we all knew, everyone there knew the filibuster was going to be the thing. And so I want to show you a short clip, like a 45-second clip of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King, on, I believe he's on Meet the Press here, but he was on some news show talking about the Senate.
People in the United States.
I know you can't see yet. Hang on. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Let's see. So here's King. I don't know who that gentleman is. It kind of looks like Tom Brokaw, but I don't know. Next to him there.
I think the vast majority of people in the United States would vote favorably for such a bill. I think the tragedy is that we have a Congress with a Senate that has a minority of misguided senators who will use the filibuster to keep the majority of people from even voting. They won't let the majority of senators vote. And certainly they wouldn't want the majority of people to vote because they know they do not represent the majority of the American people. In fact, they represent in their own states a very small minority. I think
this language right there by Dr. King about a small minority in the U.S. Senate, the Southerners, and in the states they representing a minority of the American public, is exactly what we hear, or some chunk of what we hear today, as a problem with the U.S. Senate. So they had to deal with the same problems that we had to deal with today, of a certain body of senators blocking legislation and needing, at that time, not 60 votes, but 67 votes. All right, 67 votes. So the bar was high. And yet the audacity, the audaciousness of the goals of the movement is what should compel us today. You think it looks impossible today to pass HR 1 and S1? Surely it could not look more impossible today than it looked then to pass the Civil Rights Bill that became the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Bill that became the Voting Rights Act. And so I end here. This lecture. I end this lecture here. I started with Lyndon Johnson. I want to end Lyndon Johnson. So between 1949 and 1963, Lyndon Johnson becomes the youngest minority leader, Senate minority leader in the history of the Senate, because Dick Russell takes him under his wing and tells all of the others that he wants Johnson to be the minority leader when the Democrats are in the minority. And then when the Democrats gain the majority, Johnson becomes the youngest majority leader in the history of the Senate. Most minority and majority leaders have been well into their 40s and 50s. Johnson is in his 30s when he becomes minority and then majority leader. And then he becomes on the ticket in 1960 as the vice presidential candidate, and becomes president in 1963 when John F. Kennedy is assassinated. Johnson is the first Southern president of the United States, first Southerner to become president of the United States since Zachary Taylor in 1848 to 1852. Yeah, over 100 years, we hadn't had a Southerner as president until Johnson becomes president in 1963. And so these kinds of things will impact you. They will have a huge impact upon you. And after Kennedy's assassination, Johnson is scrambling to figure out how to carry forward the administration and to carry forward the things he believed in. And it was Johnson that had been pushing Kennedy, actually, when you read Carroll and you read other pieces about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. It had been Johnson who had been pressing and pushing on Kennedy to move on civil rights and voting rights. It had been Johnson, the Southerner, who had been pushing. And Robert Carroll writes these tomes of histories about Johnson. He's written 4 of them, and he's got the 5th coming out not distant future. And they are incredible. So if you've got hours upon hours upon hours to read, but you love to look at the way in which people influence one another and American politics is unfolded, I recommend them. They were not a turning point, but an inflection point in my own thinking about politics in this country. And Carroll, this author, writes about Johnson in the days after Kennedy's assassination. And Johnson brings together all these advisors, and they have this conversation. And Johnson says, I want to do an address to the nation. I want to speak to Congress. I want to speak to the nation. And he says, and I want to fight for civil rights. This is what I want to do. And that brings me to this excerpt that I close with tonight. On the evening of November 26th, because Kennedy had been shot on November 22nd. Advisors gathered around the dining room table in Johnson's home to consider the speech, to draft the speech. I couldn't see, it was behind my own image, to draft the speech that he was to deliver the following day to a joint session of Congress. Quick aside, they're drafting the speech hours before he's going to deliver it. That's crazy. Back in here. They argued about the amount of emphasis to be given to civil rights in that speech, Johnson's first major address as president. As Johnson sat silently listening, most of these advisors were warning that he must not emphasize the subject of civil rights because it would antagonize the Southerners who controlled Congress. The advisors told Johnson he'd need the support of the Southerners in Congress for the rest of his presidency, and that a civil rights bill had no chance of passage anyway. And then in the early hours of the morning, an advisor recalls, quote, one of the wise, practical people around the table told Johnson to his face that a president shouldn't spend his time and power on lost causes, no matter how worthy those causes might be. Johnson took this in, looked at everyone, leaned forward and said, well, what the hell's the presidency for? What the hell is the presidency for? And that's a question I have for Joe Biden today. And we're going to need a lot from Joe Biden, a lot from Joe Biden in days to come. But it's a question I could extrapolate bigger than just the presidency. What the hell is control of the Senate and the House for? Control of the presidency, the House and the Senate for, especially when you're likely going to lose control of the House, at least in 2022. What the hell is control of the presidency, the House, and the Senate for? If you're not going to bring about big structural change or block the kind of structural change that's happening around voting today. What the hell is it all for? Well, that's the question we face today. And that's the question that Johnson and others in Congress faced, and all of those folks, including some of you, who fought for the civil rights movement and the advances around civil rights and voting rights. You face that question too. In some ways, as we'll see in the next 2 days, the reality is that it was harder to break the filibuster back then. All right. In some ways, we'll see that actually it was easier. I'll talk about both of those. But it got done, and we have to figure out how to do that today. You can just see, and you're some of them, and I'm in those conversations where people would say, but we can't break it, or even if we did break it, the Supreme Court's going to overrule it. I don't know. We're going to try. We've got to try. What the hell is control of the presidency, the House and the Senate for, if not to fight for the right to vote in a democracy, for our common power? All right. Lectures 2 and lectures 3 will take us into Mississippi and into Alabama. And we'll talk about the ways in which the movement, the civil rights movement, pushed with everything it had for this, what became eventually the pathway to civil rights and to voting rights. All right. Freedom Summer and Selma and Lyndon Johnson again. Thanks so much for tonight. I'm going to grab my water, then I'll do some Q&A. If you've got questions, as Paul just put in the list, in the chat, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. I'll take a quick look and see what's in the chat, and then I'll move over to the Q&A here. In the chat, Carolyn mentioned that there's going to be a march on Washington in DC on August 28th this year to coincide with or to align with the date of the March on Washington in 1963. I do expect that march, that's the logical date to have a march this year. We will see if the national organizations get behind this. I think there's a very good chance they will, the NAACP and others, the ACLU and all of the Poor People's Campaign and others. But I am certainly paying close attention to this. And if that march develops, it will be something that I will be going to. And I would encourage people to think about it. All right. Okay, I'm going to look in the Q&A here. Jim Marshall started us off and said, my name is Jim Marshall. I would like to see who and how many people have logged on. Hello to Bob Zellner and all the veterans, the civil rights veterans participating tonight. Yes, Bob Zellner will be joining us actually tomorrow night a little bit. Zellner was part of the civil rights movement, the first Southern white person who was a field secretary in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he had shared these lectures with all of the veterans. There's a civil rights veteran cluster of folks. And he had shared it with them. So Jim, there's about 240 people that are signed up for this. And tonight, I don't know, 100 plus have signed on to watch. The rest will watch it on recording. And everybody's welcome to share it with anybody you want since you registered to vote. I'm registered for the series. Carol asks, what's the basis for Johnson's change in his attitude? Rich asks this under Carol's heading. What is the basis for Lyndon Johnson's change in his attitude on civil rights legislation between 1949 and November 26, 1963? It's a great question, Rich. It's an impossible question to definitively answer. Johnson's such a complicated human being, but we can get some sense of it. He on the strategic front, he knew that he could not gain power in this country or hold power in this country and get reelected in 1964 without advocating for civil rights. He could not move to the presidency or even to the VP position without getting civil rights bills passed in 57 and 1960. He knew he needed to do that in order to earn support among Northern white liberals. And then in 1963, he knew he had no chance to get reelected. And in fact, that he would face Robert Kennedy in 1964 if he didn't take up the mantle of civil rights. So we can think of it purely in pure, I have a hard time saying this. I say pure as in P-E-R, as well as pure, P-U-R-E. And then there's like the pier. Did you jump off it in the water? So I use a different word. So in solely strategic terms, we can think of Johnson on that front. But it doesn't, I don't buy that. I've read Caro's books. I've read a lot about Johnson. And it seems to me that the core kind of elements of Johnson, his fight for the underdog, his belief in the American dream for all, they go back really deep. And they go back well into his upbringing in dirt poor Texas. And his fight for people of color, Latino, early in his political career. So if anything, I felt that his kind of who's the real Johnson? To me, it's actually the one who did want to fight for civil rights. He passes and signs this incredible body of legislation, but that includes education and immigration and civil rights. But you can see dimensions of this even when he's a senator or in the House back in the 1940s. So I think that actually we see more of the genuine Johnson once he begins to kind of pursue this kind of notion of America for all. Now, he was racist, deeply racist, but he did understand very much so how power could be used to be deployed for the good of all Americans. So is it a change, or is it just more of a kind of a coming to a public standing of who he was. I think it's more of the latter, that when you merge together the strategy with who I think he was, that he knew the strategy was he had to be a Southerner, we of the South, in order to gain power. And then he had to be someone who could appeal to the North. These are strategies. And that ultimately there was strategy involved in pushing for civil rights when he became president. But that it also seemed, in my mind, and from what I've seen historically, to merge with a body of sensibilities that really captured who Johnson was. I have done a longer lecture on Johnson where I untangle all of that, but so I'm just kind of referencing that here. Nancy, I see you ask it the identical same question. John asks, does C-SPAN or any other news organization cover filibuster debates? Or are they totally out of the public eye today? There are no filibuster debates today, John. There aren't. There are no debates. There is negotiation. There is discussion. There are meetings, but there are not. None of these are official debates or conversations that are official Senate business. So there's nothing to cover. Back in the night, and I'll be talking about this the next couple of days. In the 1960s, the news networks were reporting daily live from the Capitol during the filibusters that we're going to see in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Karen asks, as to federal elections and federal legislation, do I think Roberts would defer to the feds? By which I assume you mean, Karen, the Congress. So the question is, do I think John Roberts, as Chief Justice, would defer to the Congress if the Congress were to pass these bills? I think that if Congress were to pass these bills, that they're going to inevitably be chipped away at by the U.S. Supreme Court. However, that doesn't in any way, shape, or form stop me from wanting these bills to be passed, because that chipping away would take years. And also, Roberts's solution to most things that when he rules contrary to Senate, to congressional bills. I'm sorry, when he rules against standing legislation, and he says that it violates the Constitution, his answer always is, if Congress disagrees with this, because he's overturning like Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, or back in 2013, Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, that if Congress disagrees, they should pass new legislation. Now that's a pipe dream in our polarized space, but we got to try, and we got to figure out a way to get it done. So if that's his solution in his opinions, then if Congress were to actually pass legislation, it would be ethically a harder hill for Roberts to climb, to throw out that legislation under the Constitution. Doesn't mean it can't happen and wouldn't be done, but it would be an ethically harder hill to climb. And I think that Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett are much more conservative than I want them to be on the court. But they have written a series of decisions this term and Kavanaugh last year that are, they're not Scalia or Alito or Thomas or Gorsuch. They're centrist left, centrist right. And I think that, you never know what's going to happen on the court in terms of lives, whether it gets bigger. So I don't think of the court as forever lost by any means. I mean, it's not a useful place to be. So I'm all about passing legislation and just doing the best we can. Kathleen says, is it true that we're talking about 60 senators and not 60% of the senators who are present? If so, this means the minority doesn't even need to show up to vote. Yes, Kathleen, that is what we're talking about. We're talking about 60 senators and not 60% of the senators who are present. Now, that could be changed through mutual agreement of the majority leader and the minority leader to make a vote be solely determined by those who are present. But it is not going to be changed in the current, that agreement is not going to be reached. So it takes 60 senators today to move bills past the motion to proceed and to end debate. Now, I'm going to be talking on Wednesday about we should flip this and put the focus on 41 senators, you got to get to 41 in order to get to block the bill, and to put all the public pressure and attention on them rather than the attention of getting to 60. And I think that's a reform that we can, in terms of the rule itself, it wouldn't change the rule, but it could change it to, instead of trying to get to 60, you got to get to 41, and then they got to hold they got to get to 41. All right. I think that's a useful way to go. Let's see. Somebody asked, has President Biden made efforts to eliminate the filibuster so far? Well, Biden doesn't get the ability to like, if you mean efforts, like, has he made a public push? Not really. He's spoken a little bit about it, but it's going to take a much greater push by Biden to have any chance of this. If you want to eliminate the filibuster, it's going to take a lot greater push. I don't know if the elimination is going to happen. So I'm not really focused in these lectures on eliminating the filibuster. I'm here to talk about how we beat the filibuster by it stays in place, but how we can defeat the filibuster. That's what these are about. These lectures are not about eliminating the filibuster. These lectures are about defeating the filibuster. All right. That's what we've got to be prepared to try to do. And I'll end with Nancy's question here. Nancy says, you mentioned me, that the Dems need to know the Senate rules and procedures inside out. Do I have confidence that the Senate Dem leadership are super savvy with the rules and the procedures and how to maneuver? No. It's clear when you read Caro's books about LBJ, and then the way in which LBJ guided the Senate leadership when he was president, that there was an understanding of parliamentary maneuvering, and also the way in which they built communications teams and sub caucuses within the majority, because they needed to get 67 votes. The level of attention and detail and thoroughness that was in place was just astounding. And when I've been reading about that recently, as I'm putting these lectures together, I'm going to pull in portions of that tomorrow, especially because the breaking of the filibuster for the Civil Rights Act, which was a step towards the Voting Rights Act, was much harder to break because it was the first one. That the level of attention to the maneuvering and the actions of the Senate were just spectacular, about the attention. And yes, this is where I've begun to adopt a posture of, I want to see the Democrats show us that they are prepared to all that it takes within the bounds of the rules. Like, I'm not here again in these lecture series to push for the elimination of the filibuster. I am down for that. But I think within the rules themselves, there is a ton of things that can be done. Okay. So no, Nancy, I don't have confidence in the Democratic leadership to have that kind of knowledge. And this is not really shade upon them. My reality is that they just simply don't live in that minutia the way you need to. If I get a diagnosis that is a horrible health diagnosis, and I'm told that the way in which we can best deal with this is to learn everything possible, inside and out, about some health matter, and the food that it takes, and the medicine, and the exercise of the behaviors, and the climatological elements, then you know damn well that I'm going to be highly motivated to learn all of that. That's on me. I want to see that level of energy and attention from the Democratic leadership. This is on us to push them on that. So I'll be talking more about that as we go. So, all right, everybody, thanks for coming tonight. I'm going to I'll put this up on YouTube and send it out on email later tonight. And I'll look forward to seeing you all tomorrow night. All right, take care. Bye-bye.